how the people are doing. So, oh man, shifting countries, it takes a minute, doesn't it? An entire month to be very precise. And the worst bloody part is that it took me 2 days to settle into this apartment, and the entire month was spent for documentation. That's it, just documentation and waiting around. Especially with the X100 Ultra, because I had this for the entirety of the month, and I took the photos, obviously, but I couldn't make the comparison. I've been dying to talk about this. There's so much going on. There's also the new iPhone. The 16 Pro is here. It arrived this week, and there's some interesting stuff going on there. I've never said that about new iPhones. It doesn't happen often, especially with the cameras. There's a lot that Apple has done, which I don't think is getting enough credit, which is weird. Usually it gets too much credit, let's just say, but that's not really what's happening this time around. Maybe I'm wrong. But of course, the interesting thing is that today, the X100 Ultra is going up against the Pixel 9 Pro XL. And there's just a lot to unfold, so let's jump in. Alright then, we may be in a different country, but we are now changing certain traditions. The first and foremost is, of course, the color profiles. Now, the X100 Ultra, just like its predecessor, well, not a predecessor, I guess, it's lesser brethren, the X100 Pro, it has the same color profiles. We have the vivid colors, which is vibrant. The Pixel, on the other hand, you can choose anything and everything you want. It doesn't give you profiles necessarily, but you can fine-tune it to your heart's desire. And in this case, it's the default, of course, but you can choose anything you want, and the default, in my opinion, looks pretty good. There's, of course, nice natural colors, which gives you a good amount of contrast this time around, which is nice. I always like high contrast. And very natural colors. As you can tell, it is slightly more natural as opposed to the Pixel, which is just generally very vibrant with the sky. But that's not the case on the X100. But then textured mode, I try this every single time, and every single time the X100 or Vivo in general kind of disappoints me with the textured mode, because the way they do it is it's a little too heavy-handed. And that's exactly what it is once again. It does continue to keep getting better little by little, sure. But it's still not quite there yet. I can't really recommend you to just use this on a regular basis, because as you can tell, it can't really handle dynamic range nearly as well, and sometimes it will oversaturate, as I said, heavy-handed. But what absolutely blows my mind is the fact that dynamic range in general is not that good on the X100 Ultra. This is unprecedented, to say the least. It makes no sense. I'm not sure why that's the case, but yeah, this is what we're dealing with. It's as though the sun is always blown out. I mean, every single shot that I took that was backlit, the sun was just always more blown out and didn't really have a nice enough or a smooth enough gradient to look as professional as you'd like it to. I mean, it is an Ultra device after all, and the Pixel is just doing better. But there is, I guess you could call it a silver lining, but maybe not. It's a weird situation with the ultra-wide camera. I'll get to it in a moment, but regular shots with the ultra-wide, as you can tell, they look phenomenal. If anything, I'd say the overall contrast and the balancing of the exposure is actually a little bit better sometimes on the X100 Ultra. It's not always going to be the case. There will be some back and forth between the two, but yeah, I think the ultra-wide actually fares a little bit better on the X100. And more than anything else, it's the general color accuracy or the white balance, which just seems to be perfect on the X100 Ultra. Funny enough, the main camera on the Pixel performs better than the ultra-wide and is the exact opposite on the X100. But then this, you see, this is where it gets weird. With the backlit shots, just help me make sense of this. With the main camera, which is the highest quality sensor, it is supposed to be the most optimized, because obviously, more often than any other camera on any smartphone, you use the main camera. Before any smartphone, I guess, but the point is, the main camera is what most people are going to use more than anything else. So why is it that the ultra-wide on the Vivo X100 Ultra has better dynamic range than not just the main camera on the Vivo, but also the ultra-wide on the Pixel, and maybe even the main camera on the Pixel? It's stunning, the dynamic range that it can preserve. It blows my mind that the main camera doesn't get the same treatment or refinement, I guess. Alright, then for the macro photography side of things, you see, the Pixel can only do macro photography with the ultra-wide camera, which is good, it's fine. But what the X100 Ultra can do is not only use the ultra-wide, but it can also use the telephoto camera for essentially a different kind of macro photography. What it allows for is a terribly high amount of depth of field, which is stunning to look at, naturally. And there is none of the ultra-wide distortion that you would usually have to deal with when you take ultra-wide macro shots. So the options alone, that should give the X100 Ultra a nice little edge, shouldn't it? But then of course we have zoom. Now zoom is particularly interesting on the X100 because Vivo usually goes for a lot of hardware as opposed to relying on software. This time around they are relying on the 3x. But first, 2x, we gotta check that out, right? And I'm sure you've noticed, but the crazy thing here is that we are using the main camera both for the 1x and the 2x sensor crop. It seems the X100 is now preserving more dynamic range and much more of the highlights are under control as opposed to the Pixel, which was most definitely not the case previously. So anywho, cropping all the way into 500%, that's a steep difference. Just it doesn't even look like the Pixel is using any kind of computation for the sensor crop. It's as night and day. The detail preservation on this 2x sensor crop may just be the absolute best that I've ever seen on any smartphone for the X100 Ultra. Now then the 3x, now see this is where things get even more interesting. You see, the 3x is a blatant 200 megapixel sensor on the X100 Ultra. It's not on the main camera, it's on the 3x. The question is, can Vivo actually utilize all that resolution for something good? Because so far, with the S24 Ultra, Samsung hasn't been doing all that hot. I mean, it's good, it's a cool feature, but it's not very practical. So of course, cropping in, it is optical zoom on the X100, but I must say, the Pixel's keeping up well. This is unprecedented, which is what blows my mind. The 2x sensor crop on the Pixel was particularly bad, and I did take multiple shots in case you're wondering, but with a 3x, it's somehow able to preserve a good amount of detail as much as the X100, which, again, I didn't expect that. With every step of the way, we are seeing something or the other that is unexpected and unnatural. But well, with the 5x, the Pixel should be the one in the lead, right? It does have the optical zoom advantage, but that's not quite the case. Oh man, this is hilarious. Like, I'm telling you, I did not plan this, but this is about as perfect of a camera comparison as it can be, because every single time you expect something from one of these phones, the tables just turn. It's a beautiful thing. And then I also included a 30x zoom right here. I think it's 30x at least. It took this a while back. I may be wrong, it may be a 10x, but look, the point is this. The X100 still looks better. It's significantly better as opposed to the Pixel. Pixel has too much artifacting, noise, and the grain, the sharpening, it doesn't really seem up to par, especially for having an optical zoom advantage. Now, we are not done testing details though. The zoom is just one side of the coin. The other side is high res. Now, I know high res is not used particularly much, at least I don't use it on a regular basis. I don't really see a lot of point in it, but we gotta test it out, right? So with the main camera, the X100 takes the lead. It simply has less processing and more detail and less sharpening, so it just makes sense, doesn't it? But then with the ultra-wide camera, you might think the result is going to be very similar. The X100 should pull ahead, right? Well, we have had a lot of surprises, haven't we? So let's not predict anything. And guess what? The Pixel this time pulls ahead. So here's the deal. The X100 Ultra's ultra-wide camera has better dynamic range than both its main camera and also the Pixel, but it is lacking in terms of detail preservation, especially with high res. Now then the 3x, so you see this is exactly what I've been looking forward to testing, because X100 Ultra is putting all its cards on the table with that 200 megapixel sensor, which can also produce 50 megapixel shots if that's something you're interested in. And I think that's something you should be using more often than the 200 because, you know, file size and all that jazz. And so at 3x, obviously the Pixel's not going to pull ahead. It doesn't even have the optical zoom, so it doesn't really matter. The X100 looks very detailed, maybe slightly processed and slightly sharpened, but it looks good. And then of course the 200 megapixel one. Does it actually make a difference? Yeah, kinda. It seems to be significantly more detailed, and it doesn't have the sharpening and processing that we saw with the 50 megapixel mode. So it does contribute in a meaningful manner, which is, I think this is the first time I've seen 200 megapixels look blatantly and definitively better as opposed to the 50 megapixel mode. That's quite something. Now look, that's not to say the 200 megapixel mode on something like the S24 Ultra isn't better than the 50, but it's not this much of a difference that we see. And now this one's going to be the interesting one. So the question is, will a 50 megapixel shot at 5x optical zoom be better than the 3x from the X100 Ultra, which is shot at 200 megapixels? We're gonna match the framing obviously, and well, there's only one way to find out. I think it's fair to say the results speak for themselves. Now look, in all fairness, I get it, the Pixel isn't exactly renowned for being good at detail preservation or anything like that. It's not incredible, but the difference, it's night and day. We cannot ignore that fact. So yeah, this is gonna be particularly interesting when we compare against the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, because that thing has two high-res and very high-quality optical zooms. So yeah, stay tuned for that, it's coming. But then of course, the selfie camera. Now, with the selfie camera, I've noticed a little issue on the X100 Ultra. First and foremost, the Pixel has one of the best and one of my personal favorites in terms of selfie cameras, because it is very wide. It can go ultra wide, and I really like that. I prefer my face to be as far away from the camera as possible, because I don't really like taking selfies. The X100 on the other hand, it's not as wide, but it also seems to blow out highlights ever so often. It's not always going to be the case, but overall, especially if the highlights are on your face, they will get blown out at some point or the other. Even though, for some odd reason, it can actually handle dynamic range when it's backlit really well. Like in this particular case, you can see the Pixel is significantly worse as opposed to the X100. It's just better processing that's allowing the X100 to pull ahead by a massive margin. And I would say it's a fairly similar story when it comes to selfie portraits as well. Sometimes it can blow out some highlights on your face, but again, if you're shooting straight into a sunset and the sun is right behind you, it's actually going to perform really well. It can produce some kind of flattering looking, reddish skin tones, as you can tell, as opposed to the Pixel, which tries to maintain as much of the natural color tones as possible. That's gonna depend on preference. I don't mind the flattering skin tones, but I would have preferred slightly more contrast in certain situations. But yeah, overall, it's not exactly disappointing or anything. The Pixel is not particularly great with dynamic range when it comes to backlights. But then, the tables really do turn when it comes to the night selfies, because the Pixel, as you can tell, is doing significantly better as opposed to whatever the X100 is trying over here. And yeah, I know I look kinda tired in that particular image. You wanna know why? It's because I was. Let's move on. So, rear camera portraits, the Achilles heel of the Pixel 9 Pro XL. It absolutely and utterly sucks balls on the Pixel. Look, there's no two ways about it. The Pixel can do rear camera portraits between 1.5x and 3x, if I'm not wrong. And it's basically not going to allow you to use any optical zoom that it has, not the 1x or the 5x, which is just the stupidest thing. It makes no sense. And the X100 Ultra is significantly better in that regard. Also, edge detection is horrendous on the Pixel 9 Pro XL. However, I do seem to once again notice that similar issue that we saw previously on the selfies and selfie portraits on the X100, where it would slightly blow out the highlights. It's not as bad as the selfies, but you can see my bicep is blown out. That's not cool. And then of course, not gonna leave you guys hanging, we have a backlit portrait. Yeah, I know, not exactly very practical. I've been thinking about the practicality of backlit portraits a lot, but regardless, it's just better on the X100. At this point, the portrait mode is by far the worst that I've ever used on the Pixel 9 Pro XL, which sucks because Pixel's all about software. So where's that software processing when it comes to portraits? And now finally we have night mode. Now, there is a disclaimer here. You see, in previous camera comparisons, I used to live in India. And there, nighttime is significantly darker as opposed to Dubai. I think you can tell. These phones barely even had to take long exposures. The Pixel probably took a 1 second, far as I can remember. The X100, it didn't even need to do it. It is usually that bright all over the city. That's just the way it is. I can't really control that stuff. However, that does not mean that we don't get differences between the two. You see, sure, it's easy when you have a lot of lights, but there will be differences. And that's exactly what we have right here, because you see, the X100 Ultra, not only does it require almost no long exposure most of the time when it's producing basically exact same quality of night mode shots in general, but if you were to look at the detail preservation specifically, it is actually better on the X100 Ultra. So less shutter lag and better detail preservation along with every other benefit of night mode. I think that's a very obvious win on the X100. And then moving on to the ultra wide camera, and look, I had to take the classic Burj Khalifa shot. It has to happen. It's akin to a human rights violation if you were to visit Dubai and not take this particular type of shot. But look, here's the deal. I don't like the sky on either of these. Now you might be thinking, well, the Google obviously has a truckload of artifacting. Obvious reason not to like it, but the X100 looks phenomenal. It's perfectly smooth. There's no problems in there. Well, personally, I prefer really nice and dark night skies. Kind of like the tone that we're getting on the Pixel. That is very nice. It looks very nighttime-esque. It's a little flat and a little too bright on the X100. That's a tendency that the X100 has. It's just the way it goes. There are very few phones that can produce genuinely nighttime looking shots, and the X100 isn't exactly one of them. It's actually really good for taking photos in the city because you have a lot of bright lights, so it'll naturally give you a lot of contrast. Like in this case, you can see the night sky, because of how much light is in the foreground, it is giving us a lot of contrast, natural contrast. The problem on the Pixel, on the other hand though, is that it's really washing out all the warmth, the beautiful warmth that we're getting on the X100. That's how it naturally looked. And now for 2x with night mode. You see, I'm facing the same kind of problem. The Pixel is just removing all of the warmth, which is unfortunate because it looks really nice and it's how the scene was lit, so why remove it? Anywho, zooming in, and it's obvious, the X100 is significantly better. It was better at daytime and it is still way better at night. Maybe the difference isn't as drastic as daytime because, you know, nighttime usually causes issues. With the 3x on the other hand, obviously, the X100 is gonna pull it. I mean, I don't even need to zoom in at this point. I will, just for the sake of courtesy. And yes, the X100 is just performing better. Would you like to guess why? It has a really good sensor and it's optical zoom. The Pixel is neither. Now at 5x, the Pixel does have optical zoom. However, the X100, it has surprised us with that 200 megapixel sensor and just the way it utilizes it. It's really good. So, can it stack up at night? That's the greatest test of all. Look, I understand, it's not the best subject for this. It doesn't really have a lot of texture that we can derive details from, but the edges are still there. I'd say it's actually performing better as opposed to the Pixel 9 Pro XL. Well then, that finally brings us to the end of this comparison, which is, I'd say this is quite possibly the most interesting one that I've ever made because there's so many odd and nuanced differences that don't necessarily belong, right? It's weird to say the least. It's like the dynamic range issue that we noticed because it doesn't really exist on any other Vivo flagship that I've ever used. And then obviously there's the whole situation with the portrait mode on the Pixel being completely trashed. We've known that. But then the zoom situation, very unprecedented. The fact that the lack of proper optical zoom was not a disadvantage on the X100 Ultra. Didn't expect that in the slightest. Hell, if anything, it's actually fine-tuned and optimized so well that it can utilize that 200 megapixel sensor, which I'm sure is a very high quality sensor, no doubt about that, but it can utilize it properly. It can produce genuine results that are actually performing even better than the Pixel at the very least. But you know what's going to be the most interesting? I mentioned this previously, but it's against the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. It's going to be beautiful, that comparison, and it's coming up soon enough. So stay tuned for that. For now, cheers.